Hello everyone, Mr. Linder here. Let's talk about filtration as a process in the nephron of the kidneys. So filtration is the first step in the production of urine. Filtration, in essence, is a non-specific process that relies on pressure to create a filtrate. Filtrate is the material that leaves the cardiovascular system and ends up in Bowman's capsule. So your filtrate is going to leave the glomerulus and end up into the surrounding Bowman's capsule. About 20% of the plasma that is filtered in the nephrons actually ends up in the Bowman's capsule. That 20% is known as the filtration fraction. So not all of the blood that comes into the kidneys is filtered all at once. In fact, 80% of your blood remains in the cardiovascular system, while only 20% is actually moving into the nephron system. And so again, that 20% is called the filtration fraction. What remains behind is going to be your blood cells, your large proteins, and those are actually going to draw water into the cardiovascular system, and that's going to keep your blood flowing through the capillaries and then flowing through the venous system and exiting the kidney. So again, only about 20%, the filtration fraction, actually enters into the nephron system at a given point in time. And then, of course, a lot of that is reabsorbed. So 19% of that fluid is reabsorbed. So your excretion volume is really low. It's less than 1% for the day. So even though we may filter 180 liters per day, the excretion is only about 1.5 liters per day. So we have a very little amount of excretion as we filter in the nephron systems. When we look at the anatomical structures, what you want to be able to see is that we have small vessels that come into the glomerulus. Those are the afferent arterioles. And so those are feeding the capillary network that we call the glomerular capillaries. And then we have an efferent arteriole that's exiting the glomerulus, and that's where that 80% of blood is going. And so the filtration fraction, that 20%, is what's entering into Bowman's capsule and then eventually going into the proximal convoluted tubule. In order for filtration to take place, it relies on podocyte cells of the glomerular capsule surrounding the glomerular capillaries. So if we were to zoom in on that cellular structure, so again, here's the podocyte cells surrounding the glomerular capillaries, what you're going to see is with the glomerular capillaries and the podocyte cells, what you see is there are pores or holes, if you will, in the capillaries, and there are filtration slits in the podocyte cells, and then this would be the basement membrane in between. And so we are crossing these barriers, if you will, in order to produce filtrate, the material that's being filtered from the cardiovascular system. So blood from the cardiovascular system is in the glomerular capillaries, and then because of these filtration structures, we're able to force material into Bowman's capsule that we call filtrate. And this is all driven by blood pressure. It's driven by blood pressure and essentially the anatomy of the glomerular capillaries and the podocyte cells of Bowman's capsule that allows for us to generate filtrate that then can go on to be processed in order to become urine. So filtrate and urine are not the same thing. Filtrate is what gets filtered into Bowman's capsule, and that's a non-specific process. The filtrate is going to have water, electrolytes, it's going to have nutrients. So it's going to have things like glucose and amino acids. And then, of course, there's going to be waste in there as well, which is one of the things that we're trying to get rid of. But there are good materials, if you will, and there are bad materials, if you will, that we would want to keep a lot of these things. So a lot of the water and the electrolytes and the nutrients are going to be reabsorbed, and we're going to get rid of the waste material. So that's why filtrate and urine are not the same thing. There has to be a processing that takes place. So what drives the filtration then? Well, we said it's a blood pressure, but let's take a closer look at what's actually happening. So when we look at the afferent arteriole bringing blood into the glomerulus, the afferent arteriole has a certain blood pressure. So the pressure on average is about 55 millimeters of mercury. So the capillary blood pressure averages about 55 millimeters of mercury as it enters into Bowman's capsule. And so this is, in essence, the blood pressure that is going to be pushing material through those pores and through those filtration slits and pushing material into Bowman's capsule. So it's that 55 millimeters of pressure. However, there's going to be pressure drawing fluid back into the cardiovascular system. So remember, 80% of the blood is still in the cardiovascular system. The filtration fraction is only about 20%. So because there are blood cells, because there are proteins remaining in the cardiovascular system, they have an osmotic pressure. So they're going to be drawing fluid back towards them. So the capillary osmotic pressure averages about 30 millimeters of mercury. And again, notice the direction of the arrow. That's pulling things into the capillary, into the glomerulus. And that's going to keep water, right, in water and some electrolytes and nutrients in the cardiovascular system. But that's going to allow your blood to still flow through the efferent arteriole. Without the fluid in the cardiovascular system, your blood would get too thick and it wouldn't flow. So we have blood coming into the glomerulus at a pressure of about 55 millimeters of mercury. And so we're trying to filter, we're trying to push things out. But we're also have a pressure, an osmotic pressure, that's drawing fluid back into the capillary system. We also have a capsular fluid pressure. The capsular fluid pressure averages about 15 millimeters of mercury. So that's the pressure that's in the Bowman's capsule because there's fluid in the nephrons. So capsular fluid pressure at about 15 millimeters of mercury is pushing against the blood pressure as well. That's drawing material back into the cardiovascular system. So if you look at these three pressures, it's important to note that we need a large blood pressure if we're going to overcome the osmotic pressure and the capsular fluid pressure. So our equation for net filtration would look something like this. We have a blood pressure of 55 millimeters of mercury. We have an osmotic pressure of 30, but that's opposing the blood pressure, so it's a subtraction. Osmotic pressure is going against the blood pressure. We also have a capsular fluid pressure. So we have a capsular pressure of about 15, and again, that's negative because it's going against the blood pressure. So our net filtration would be 55 minus 45, which gives us a net filtration of plus 10. So we're at plus 10 millimeters of mercury, which is pushing fluid into Bowman's capsule so that we can generate filtrate. So it might be fairly obvious to note that if you had problems with your blood pressure, if your blood pressure was severely low, that could ultimately affect your net filtration pressure, which ultimately would affect your kidney function. So hypotension can be dangerous for kidney function because there's not enough pressure coming into the kidneys to cause filtration. So what do we call this filtration? This is how we generate the filtrate. We have enough blood pressure to overcome osmotic pressure and capsular pressure. What we call this is essentially the glomerular filtration rate. That plus 10 millimeters of mercury is going to result in the production of filtrate. And so we have a glomerular filtration rate. Glomerular filtration rate represents the volume of fluid that's entering Bowman's capsule per unit of time. And that's typically about 125 milliliters per minute, which is a very high filtration rate. That works out to be about 7.5 liters per hour, which is more than, right, it's greater than your blood volume. So it's more than average blood volume. 7.5 liters per hour is greater than the 5 to 6 liters of blood that we have in our cardiovascular system. So you're actually filtering a large amount of fluid. And per day, that works out to be about 180 liters per day. So we have a very large filtration that's taking place in the glomerulus and into Bowman's capsule. What affects the GFR? Well, the GFR is influenced by the overall net filtration pressure, so whatever pressure we can generate. So obviously that is affected by blood pressure. And it's also affected by the filtration coefficient. So net filtration pressure is affected by our overall blood pressure, our systemic blood pressure, and the pressure that's entering into the kidneys, so what we would call renal blood flow. Our filtration coefficient is going to be affected by the surface area of the glomerular capillaries and the permeability of the glomerular capillaries and Bowman's capsule. So those anatomical structures, if something was to affect the cells of the glomerular capillaries or the podocyte cells of Bowman's capsule, that's going to affect the overall surface area, and that's going to affect our ability to filter properly. So net filtration pressure and filtration coefficient are going to affect our overall GFR. What's interesting is that GFR is fairly stable throughout the day. We actually have very good autoregulatory mechanisms within the kidney to keep the GFR at a fairly constant rate, even though our blood pressures can change throughout the day. We typically look at mean arterial pressure, what we call the MAP pressure. Mean arterial pressure is equal to your diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of your pulse pressure. The pulse pressure is the difference between systolic pressure and diastolic pressure. So pulse pressure equals systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure. So you could take a blood pressure, 120/80, and you could calculate the mean arterial pressure. If we were to calculate the mean arterial pressure of this blood pressure, 120/80, we would take 80 plus 1/3 of the pulse pressure, which would be 40, because that's the difference between 120/80. So we get 80 plus about 13.3, and that would give us a MAP pressure of 93.3. So if we look at a MAP pressure in the 90s, right, if we looked at the mean arterial pressure in the 90s, that's going to fall onto the normal line for glomerular filtration rate. That's going to keep us at this 180 liters per day of filtration. And you'll notice that normal is between 80 and 180 millimeters of mercury per day, millimeters of mercury for our MAP pressure, which is going to keep us at 180 liters per day of filtration. And that's because we have these autoregulatory mechanisms that take place within the kidney to keep the GFR constant. So when MAP pressures are between 80 and 180, so if your blood pressure goes down or if your blood pressure goes up, as long as the MAP stays between 80 and 180, we can average filtration at about 180 liters per day. GFR is primarily regulated by changing blood flow, particularly through the afferent arterioles. So if we were to look at a diagram that shows afferent arteriole, efferent arteriole, and the glomerulus, so here's the glomerular capillaries, and if we were to look at the GFR, we can see how we can adjust to maintain GFR even if blood pressure is changing throughout the day. So, for example, when the afferent arteriole vasodilates, okay, so this is showing vasodilation. When the afferent arteriole, so they're looking at a little clamp here just to give you an indicator. If the afferent arteriole vasodilates, that's going to allow more blood to flow into the glomerulus, which is going to increase the overall blood pressure entering into the glomerulus. And so that's going to lead to an increase in the GFR. So vasodilation of the afferent arteriole increases the glomerular filtration rate. If we were to vasoconstrict, so vasoconstriction, if you were to vasoconstrict the afferent arteriole, that's going to decrease the flow, right? So we have less flow, decreased flow into the glomerulus. So if less blood is entering into the glomerulus, then we're going to see a decrease in the GFR. So we can increase the GFR when we vasodilate the afferent arteriole. We can decrease the GFR when we vasoconstrict the afferent arteriole. What about the efferent arteriole? When we look at the efferent arteriole, we can look at vasoconstriction versus vasodilation. In this diagram, we have vasoconstriction. If you were to vasoconstrict, okay, to squeeze down on the efferent arteriole, that's actually going to cause blood to essentially dam inside the glomerulus. So we're going to have increased blood pressure due to essentially a damming effect, right? We create a dam here. So blood is remaining in the glomerulus. It's going to increase the blood pressure. And so that's going to lead to an increase in the GFR. So it's the opposite of what you see with the afferent arteriole. When you vasoconstrict the efferent, we're going to see an increase in the GFR. So if you were to vasodilate, so vasodilation of the efferent arteriole, that would lead to a decrease in the GFR because that's going to let the blood flow out of the glomerulus easier. The blood pressure can drop, and therefore we can decrease the GFR. So by auto-regulating the vessels, we can affect the glomerular filtration rate. Again, the primary way to do this is through affecting the afferent arteriole. So vasoconstricting and vasodilating the afferent arteriole is the main way that we can adjust the GFR and the filtration rate in the nephron. So that's a little bit on filtration in the nephron. I hope that helps. Take care.